Hello, book lovers. Welcome to Must Love Books. And we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to RomanceCon. I'm Crystal Hope. I am the host of Must Love Books podcast, which focuses on a lot of author interviews. And today we have an author here for a live recording for everyone. I also do a lot of game nights, and we host the Something Smutty book clubs. There's a little bit of something for everyone. We talk about horror, romance, genre fiction, and important book topics such as diversity, representation, and the political nature of books. I will go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Brigid Kemmerer. I am an author of about 18 young adult novels spanning from fantasy to contemporary to even some paranormal romance. But most recently, I had my very first adult fantasy romance come out, Warrior Princess Assassin. It just released a few weeks ago, and I'm just really excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here. This is my first big live recording, so thank you everyone for being here and supporting the podcast. I have a few questions for our guest author today, and then we will allow all of you to ask any questions that you have as well. So what I always start with is, Brigid, will you let all of our listeners know about your newest novel, which I did just read, and it was really, really good.
Oh, so Warrior Princess Assassin, as I said, it is definitely, if you're familiar with any of my YA, like A Curse so Dark and Lonely or Defy the Night, this one is definitely not YA. It's still my typical writing style, but it is definitely in the adult space. And it's about a princess named Jory, who, much like a lot of princesses in fantasy literature, is not treated all too well by her family. She is subject to an arranged marriage. She does not get along with her older brother, who is acting regent. She feels very left behind by her father, but she has a secret best friend who is an assassin who sneaks into her room to visit her occasionally. Jory is, of course, completely in love with this assassin, but cannot do anything about it because, being a princess, she knows she has to marry for political reasons, not for love. However, she's completely afraid of this marriage that she is about to go into to the warrior king named Maddox Chironin. He controls fire. He is known as being just this fierce, horrible, terrible man, and she wants nothing to do with him. The night before she's about to get married, her assassin friend shows up in her room and says, "I have received new orders. I've been ordered to kill the man that you're about to marry, and I've been ordered to kill you. What should we do about it?" And I'm so in love with this story, and I hope you all get to read it.
It is a setting that I personally appreciate, and I really enjoyed reading this book. So thank you for writing it for me. So I always like to ask my authors, where did you get this inspiration?
My books always start with the characters. And for probably a month, I just had this vivid image in my head of this princess sitting in her room, waiting for this assassin to come visit her, and not knowing what was going on with her life, not feeling very in control of anything that was happening. And I knew that they just had this very, very close relationship that they wanted to be more, but could not act on, this whole tragic love. And then I kept thinking about, what am I going to do with this other guy that she's supposed to marry? And I sat on this for a long, long time until I finally started to build out kind of the kingdom and what kind of conflicts they were going to face, and just kind of went from there.
I love that. So one thing that I always talk about with my guests on the podcast is your writing process as an author. We do actually have a lot of aspiring authors who listen to the podcast, so it's always something that I like to share with those listeners. And sometimes us readers just like to hear it too. So what does a day of writing look like for you?
So for me, I have 3 kids, so they get in the way a lot.
As they do.
For me, during the pandemic, when, my kids had to come home and everybody had to, basically do the, pandemic homeschooling, I had started writing very early in the morning, and I kind of have not given that up. I like to get up very early. I like to try to get a good start on the writing first thing in the morning. And then once I get the kids off to school, I will try to hit whatever my daily word count is that I was trying to hit for that day. But as far as like my overall writing process, For me, I know there's always this debate, like, are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? Where do you really do detailed outlines, or do you just kind of fly by the seat of your pants? When you start really moving into publishing, especially in traditional publishing, if you were a pantser, I was absolutely a pantser. If you were a pantser, you kind of lose control of that, because once you start selling books on proposal, before they pay you, the publisher kind of wants to know, what is this about? So I am not as much of a pantser anymore, but I'm not a fully detailed plotter. I'm much more of a discovery writer. I like to know, the points that I like to hit, but I do like to discover things about my characters, about the story as I write.
I love that.
Thanks.
So before starting our audience questions, I'm going to turn on a microphone, and then we'll go ahead and pass this around.
Was there something that prompted you to move from YA to adult, or just something you always imagined you would get to or try out?
Both, kind of. It's been funny as people have read Warrior Princess Assassin and like some of my early reviews. People would be like, "Oh wow, Brigid Kemmerer really grew up," and I'm like, I feel the need to be clear that I was an adult through the whole process. I was writing for teens. I was not myself a teen. My very first book came out in 2012. And so I have a lot of readers who have kind of grown up with me and have just read my books for years. And then really over the last 5 years, as fantasy romance, romantasy has really kind of exploded in popularity, a lot of readers were reading in the YA space because that's where a lot of women were kind of, thanks to publishing, a lot of women were writing. And then as we started getting more and more adult readers in the YA space, a lot of YA authors felt compelled to push the boundaries of, what would normally happen in a YA novel. And just as the industry shifted and changed, as my readers started to grow up, I love hearing from readers, and I get the most amazing messages. And I have some who they would email me and be like, you came to my school in 7th grade and I love your books. But then I'll have another message and they'll be like, I graduated from high school today and I had to tell you because I loved your books. And they'll be like, I graduated from college, and now I have readers who've been reading. This actually makes me emotional. I have readers who've been reading me since they were little, in 6th and 7th grade, who are now I had my first baby. And it's do you know what I mean? And the mom in me is I love you all, right? And it's really touching to me. And just all of this everything came together. And I was like, what? I am ready to kind of write some books in the adult space. My very long answer, sorry. My Defy the Night trilogy, even in that one, even though it's totally 100% appropriate for, middle school and high school kids, but the characters in that book are all 18 to 25 years old. So I've really been writing in that space. And I finally, in discussion with my agent and, as far as my next project, I was like, I might as well just go all in.
So for Warrior Princess Assassin, the first character that started, or that sparked in your brain?
For me, it was either the princess or the assassin. That was just such a clear, vivid image in my head of those two. And then the warrior, the king, he kind of came along a little bit later in my thoughts as I was kind of figuring out the conflict among all three of them.
Were you watching the grocery store, or taking a shower, or listening to a song?
I was probably driving because I'm a chauffeur for my children right now. So I guarantee you I was on a highway somewhere and there was just chaos happening behind me.
Back real quick to the YA space. In your opinion, what age groups do you really feel belongs in young adult or YA? And do you feel like some more adult content has kind of infringed upon that label and genre of books?
So when you say what age group, do you mean what age group, as readers, or is the characters in the books? Or readers. So YA, for the longest time, traditionally was really aimed at 7th, 8th grade and up. So 13 and up. And, anytime I was writing YA, I was very, very aware of who was reading these books. And I knew I had some readers who would be as young as 11. Anytime I wrote any kind of intimacy on the page, I'm very careful about what kind of language I use, where if you know, you know. But if you don't, oh, they're just hugging, right? And it's, with YA, because of younger readers, I have a lot of really strong opinions on young adult literature in general. Probably my biggest one is that With reading, it's very different from watching a television show. So even if kids are reading about violence, if they're reading about intimacy, if they're reading about, any kind of conflict like that, there is no safer way to experience that than through a book, truly. With a TV show, you can't unsee something. I remember back when The Hunger Games was super, super popular, and everybody was reading the books, and there were kids 11 and 12, and they loved the Hunger Games books, but then they would go see the first movie, and they were like, whoa, I was not ready for that. And, your imagination really will only carry you as far as your imagination can. Your brain, especially for kids, really protects you. So there's really not a safer way to experience those things. Publishing is one of those things where you have art intersecting with commerce, and authors feel a lot of pressure to meet readers where they are. So as readers, started coming into the YA space, as readers started wanting more, intimacy on the page, it does start to kind of cause that conflict of am I going to pay the mortgage, or am I going to stay true to, what YA should be? I don't know. I do think one thing that I love with this huge, now I'm going to get into the publishing business, with the huge surge in popularity and romantasy, there have been more and more publishers, both on the indie side and the traditional side, moving into that adult space, which I think is fantastic. And I think YA is about to go through a big reset back to being truly for the kids YA.
My question is, who was your favorite character to write in any of your books and why?
I have too many books. Oh my goodness.
That's a lot of characters.
So, I loved Harper in A Curse So Dark and Lonely. She was just a tremendous amount of fun to write. She's very spunky. She's very brave. She was just, she meets this tortured, cursed prince, and she's like, "You're not cursed. You live in a castle. Get over yourself, right?"
Right.
And so she was just a tremendous amount of fun to write. I loved Tycho in the Forging Silver series. He just never lets go of his hopeful spirit, his hopeful nature, despite all the terrible things that have happened to him. So he was just a very fun character to create. I could just sit here and run down the line and tell you why I love every character. But those are probably my top two.
I was wondering if you had any superstitions or rituals that surround your writing process. Do you do anything to get yourself prepared, light a candle?
So this is gonna make me sound like such a dork. I can generally write anywhere. I'll write it on an airplane. I'll sit on the floor in my basement. It doesn't matter. And again, having kids constantly all over you kind of trains you to be we're just going to be productive in whatever situation we can be. But for me, anytime I'm looking for inspiration, this is so stupid. I will look on YouTube for songs that I really, really like, whatever they might be, and I will look for amateur choreography set to that song. I don't know why. I just think it's cool, to see what people have done with different types of music.
Hi, this is my first experience with any of your work, so I'm super excited to hear about it from you. I'm curious, reader to your stuff, is there a certain series or book that was kind of your baby that I should start with?
Wow. Okay.
That's a good one.
That is a good one. And I mean, it depends on what you like. So I would say if you really, if you more like adult fantasy and you want a little bit more character driven with romance and a little bit of spice on the page, I would definitely say start with Warrior Princess Assassin. If you like a little bit more action adventure where it's a little more plot driven, where the romance is a little bit secondary, I would say go with the Defy the Night series. And then if you don't want fantasy at all and you just want kind of a heartbreaking romantic contemporary, Letters to the Lost.
I wanted to piggyback off your answer earlier about finding songs with the choreography. Is there a song that comes to mind that you listen to a lot with your most recent book?
For whatever reason, when I was writing Warrior Princess Assassin, I listened to so stupid. I can't believe I stopped talking about this in front of a crowd this size. I listened to Houdini by Dua Lipa a lot. I don't know why. That is the Assassin's theme song. I can't. Sorry, Asher. It is. That's your theme song.
Are you an astrology person at all? For the princess, the warrior, and the assassin, do you have an idea of what their signs would be?
Oh, wow, that's tough. I don't know. I am thinking, what's funny is I know this for some of my other characters. I would say All right, I'm thinking the princess, maybe Aquarius. I'm thinking the king, man, Taurus or Leo.
Gotta be a Leo.
All right. And
It's been decided for you.
what do you think Asher would be?
Well, most serial killers are Virgos, and I say that as a Virgo myself. An assassin isn't that far as like a professional serial
not
killer.
a Virgo. I mean, honestly, man, Asher just hates everyone in his life.
Scorpio.
Actually, Scorpio might work.
We've got Mike way down over there.
These are great questions. Thank you all so much.
I just want to say my Scorpio bestie might be like, how dare you? But also facts.
Okay, so my question is,
Sure. So all my books are traditionally published, which means I don't have like full control over the cover. I will say that I've gotten to a point in my career where I definitely get like consulting control, with the publisher, where I do have to kind of finally approve it. I will say I really love the cover for A Curse So Dark and Lonely. That's one of my favorites. And I do love the cover for Warrior Princess Assassin. It's like pink and it's got like this like gilded dagger that's on the front. And the very first rendition they sent me was terrible. And it had kind of the same theme where it was like a dagger with like fire around it. And I was like, I don't know what's happening here, but this is god awful. Sorry, publisher. But then when they sent me like a second rendition kind of following that same theme, I really loved it.
what does your publishing journey look like from that first debut novel to where you're at now?
Man, it's so way back when, we're talking like 20 years ago, when I really started to pursue traditional publishing, when I started looking at, what it was going to take to get published, I learned that it takes a lot of rejection. At the time, indie publishing was not really a path that was available to people. We're talking 2005, 2006, 2007. It just, if you wanted to get published, you had to go the traditional publishing route. As a sidebar, I love that people have so many options now. It makes me so happy. But back then, I wrote a book and I thought it was pretty good. And I started trying to query agents and I just got hit with rejection. So I went back to the drawing board and wrote another book and went through this whole query process. And I remember there was this one moment where I was really down about it, like going through all of the rejection. And so every now and again, is anybody going through the query process right now? Like a few people, right? And it's brutal, right?
It's brutal. It's rough.
But then every now and again, you will get an agent who will like send you like a nugget of encouragement. They'll be like, I really loved your writing voice here, but this, the story's not quite ready or whatever. And that you will live on that nugget for years. And so I remember I had gotten to this point where I was very down about it. And my husband asked me just this very key question. And he said, do you think that you are truly good enough that people will pay to read what you have written? And he wasn't saying this like in a jerk way. He was like genuinely challenging me like in a loving way. And I sat there and I really thought about it. And I said, yeah, I am. And he said, well, then keep going. And he has always really been very supportive and very much behind me in that way. And I did keep going. I eventually found an agent with my third book. And I remember, getting the call, that, she was going to represent me and all this stuff. And I was like, yes, this is going to be it. I'm going to sell this book for $1 million. We're going to get a new house. It's going to be phenomenal. It's going to change my life. And then that book didn't sell. So I had to write another one. I had to write another book. And that one actually did sell. It sold, and that was Storm. It was my very first book that came out in 2012. They actually don't even have it in the bookstore here because it's so old. Sorry. And then, I just kept on trucking and writing books. Debut novels generally do not sell for a lot of money. I remember everybody was like, are you going to quit your job? And I was like, no, because I don't want my kids to starve. And so I kept working full time. I kept writing. And when I got about 6 books into my career, I was about ready to quit writing because like I said, still working full time. I had 3 little kids at the time. And again, my husband, who's amazing, he was like, look, you have worked this hard and gotten this far. Like, don't give up yet. He was like, why don't you work on something that feels fun? Like not something that's under contract, not something that, your editor wants you to make a bunch of changes. Like just, why don't you find something that goes back to being a fun book for you? And I had this project that I had started in 2012 and my publisher at the time rejected it. So it had just kind of been sitting on my hard drive. So now we're in 2016, and after, he had this conversation with me, I was like, well, let me play with that again. I really did love that idea. Let me just play with it and write it for me. And I wrote like 75 pages, or I rewrote it because, writing had changed in 4 years. And I sent it off to my agent. I said, I'm having a lot of fun with this. Like, is there anything here? Do you think we could sell this? Or, and she wrote back like the same day, I love this. Write me a synopsis. I want to take it on submission. And I was like, wait, this is supposed to be my fun project. No pressure. And, but I gave her a synopsis, and the long story short, she did end up selling that book, and that ended up being A Curse So Dark and Lonely. And that book truly, truly changed my life. It sold for enough for me to try quitting my day job. And I remember my husband was like, well, maybe just work for 2 more years. And I went back to work for like 2 more days. And I was like, no, I cannot. And it was definitely very, very, quitting the day job for any author is a very, very big decision. It was terrifying for several years. But that book really did change my life, because it did let me quit that job. And then that was my very first book to ever hit the New York Times bestseller list. And I think back to that book all the time, and my husband's advice to like keep the writing fun. And anytime I get stuck and stressed out, I'm like, oh, I got to go back to having fun with it. Sorry again for all these very long answers.
That's great.
They're great for the podcast.
As like doing YA fantasy and then going into more adult fantasy, have you ever had like the small spark of idea to do like a darker romantasy kind of fantasy?
So a little bit, and I'll definitely say in the adult fantasy that it does get a little bit darker, because, I've always had characters who have had traumatic pasts or who are really going through it. I like to joke that I really love to chase my character up a tree and then set the tree on fire. And then while they're trying to figure out how to get out of the tree, I imagine their mother-in-law showing up and telling them they're doing it wrong. But when I moved into adult, I knew, that I didn't have to be quite as careful with what kind of pasts the characters were having. I will say I do still have, like, in the back of my head, there's like, oh no, you can't write about that. Brigid, you can't say that word. You can't do it. But I can, and I do now.
I was reading the synopsis for Warrior Princess Assassin. Would you say one of the
she definitely does not have just one partner.
would you say it's a wide choose?
So why choose? A lot of people have labeled it why choose, and which is totally fine. So when people say why choose, I found a lot of people, use that to refer to where everybody is focused on the woman's pleasure. And there is nothing wrong with that, by the way. In this one, everyone gets along. But I will say that at the beginning of the book, the warrior and the assassin absolutely hate each other. So there's a lot of conflict to get through.
So two short questions, I guess. What was your day job that you quit, and how old were you when you started writing?
My day job, I worked in finance. I worked in private wealth management, which sounds a lot sexier than it really was. And I started writing when I was in school. I remember late middle school, like through high school. I remember getting in trouble in a high school math class because I was like writing under my notebook. I was such a rebel. I was writing, take away my pen. But it wasn't until like my late 20s that I really started to look at like publishing as a potential option.
What is your favorite book that you didn't write?
That's not fair.
Those are fighting words.
Oh, that is so not fair. Okay. I have always loved An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. I love Can You Keep a Secret by Sophie Kinsella. It's like a deep cut. It's old. I just love it. I just love the, everything about that book so much. I loved, I don't know. I loved like Jodi Picoult's whole backlist. I read so many of her books. This is a lot of books, but yeah.
What authors inspired you to write?
Oh man, so many. But if I had to go back to like the beginning of like what authors like really made me want to be a writer, when I was in middle school in like 1991, my favorite author was Christopher Pike. And has anybody read Christopher Pike? Does anybody remember? Okay, love it. See, this is the great part about writing for adults now, is like I can ask that question and adults know who I'm talking about, but you can't ask an 8th grader if they've ever heard of Christopher Pike. Like, it's funny to me now because sometimes people will be like, YA is so dark. YA was never this dark. It never used to be dark. And I'm like, okay, wait. YA has been dark for like ever. Like being a teenager is dark, right? Like it just is. And I still remember, like, anytime somebody comes up to me and they're like, YA is too dark now. I think back to Die Softly by Christopher Pike. It was one of his most popular books. It was about a teenage boy who set up a trick camera in the cheerleaders' locker room, because, of course, being a teenage boy, he wanted to take naked pictures of girls. This would be a hugely problematic trope right now. But what his pictures actually find is that the cheerleaders are running an underground cocaine ring in the locker room. And it captures a picture of the cheerleaders murdering someone. And I'm like, listen, today's YA could never.
Of your book, are you trying to just keep it to yourself? Are you consulting like your husband or just your agent, or you kind of like bounce your ideas off, like what direction your character's going and development and everything? I'm just curious, like, do you try to keep it to yourself, or you try to talk to one or two other people?
So anytime I try to talk to my husband about bookish stuff, he is incredibly supportive in some ways. He is also a huge D&D nerd, and he will like take my story ideas and like I'll be on this track and he'll be like, but what if a monster shows up? And I'm like,
Roll for initiative.
no, like, honey, that's not how the story works. Like, what if at the end robots save everyone? I'm like, no, I love your imagination, but or I'll ask him to help me with names and he'll be like, George. I'm like, it is a fantasy novel. He'll be like, how about Fritz? I'm like, no, honey, just go pour me a glass of wine and I'll do this part. That's where the support can be. No, I generally keep a lot of it like to myself. I definitely, like, once I have written it, I will share with like a select circle of, critique partners, and I always advise authors, I'm like, get the critique partner who has teeth, who's going to like tell it to you. Tell it like it is. But then sometimes you also need your cheerleader, critique partner. You need the person who's going to be like, oh my God, I just love them. And depending on how I feel about a scene, depends on who I send it to. If I feel really insecure, I'm like, I love them. But if I feel really bold, I need to send it to the other person to tell me how I screwed it up. But as far as like the ideas, I keep all of those really close to my chest. I have a really hard time like discussing plots out loud, because as soon as somebody's like, then I just lose all my confidence.
Can you talk to us about your world building process and like when that happens with your characters and where that fits in place?
Sure. So for world building, I do not have a sexy answer. I personally, this is for me very much, this is where the discovery writer process kind of comes into play. As I write, I have a rough idea of what my world is going to be like. If there's going to be magic, I'm just saying in my head, okay, there is going to be magic. If it's part of conflict, I know how it's going to come into play. Just like in Warrior Princess Assassin, I know the king has his fire magic, and I know Jory's father has weather magic that she did not inherit. So I know those two things have to come into conflict at some point. But then beyond that, as far as my world building, I let things just kind of develop on the page as I need them, and then I'll go back and fill it in later. Or if I get halfway through the book and I'm like, oh, that's not working at all, I'm okay with it. I don't mind if I get it wrong in my rough draft, because I have no problem going back and saying, all right, we'll go back and fix it. I have one book in Forging Silver. The whole book kind of has like this treasonous spy plot. And I'd given the main character, he has a couple magical abilities, and I'd given him the ability to know if somebody is lying or telling the truth. And I got halfway through the book and I was like, okay, with the spy plot, that doesn't really work. Like, if you know if somebody's lying or telling the truth, you can just be like, did you do it? Right? It just breaks the whole book. So, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned setting up like word count goals for yourself every day. And so I was wondering what kind of word count goals you have for yourself, as well as like how long does that process take?
So for me, I generally will set myself a weekly word count goal. And then obviously that breaks down into how many I should try to hit every day. But the reason I give myself a true weekly word count goal is sometimes, like, in the beginning, I'd be like, all right, I'm going to write 1,500 words a day. And then if I missed, if one day I only wrote 600 words, you suddenly feel like the whole day is a failure. And kind of like dieting, like if you have like one day where, you're like, ate all this ice cream and popcorn or whatever, and then the next day you're like, well, I blew it off yesterday, I might as well, the word count thing happens for me the same kind of way. So what I found was, if I gave myself a weekly word count, if I only wrote 900 words one day, it was okay, because I was still working towards that count. And it depends on my deadline as far as like how much I really need to push it. I try not to let myself get in a situation where I need to write more than 1,500 words a day, because it's just really hard for me to write that much. I will make like a spreadsheet, a very quick and dirty spreadsheet, where I will say, list out like all the Fridays for, I don't know, the next 4 or 5 months. And I will say, this is what word count I need to be at in the manuscript by the end of each week. And that really does help me kind of stay on track. What I was finding before I started using the spreadsheet is that I would get in the middle of the manuscript and I would kind of be like, am I doing well? Am I writing enough? Even with word count trackers, if anybody uses Scrivener, it'll do an automatic calculation for you and say, what's your project target for the day? But even with that, it just, I don't know, something about being like, all right, I need to be at 70,000 words by this Friday just feels a little bit more manageable.
We got one over here and one way in the back.
When you're writing your books and you have a vision for how the first one is going to go and you're writing not a standalone, do you sometimes have the ending completed before you even finish like the first or second book? Do you kind of have like a vision of where the trilogy or whatever series you're writing is like going to end?
So I usually I'll have like a more detailed, again, it's not really an outline, it's more like a 2-page synopsis of what the first book is going to be. And then I'll have a much looser synopsis of where I envision the second book going. And then for the third book, it might be like a paragraph. Like these are the 3 things that I want to have happen, maybe. I am very much a linear writer. I start at the very beginning of the book and I just write straight through. All of my books are dual point of view. So like in Warrior, Princess, Assassin, there are chapters from each person's point of view. I do write it straight through. Every now and again, if I'm in a situation where I have characters who are in different areas, like in the Defy the Night trilogy, I had one segment where one character was like on one island and one character was on another island. I might write several chapters in a row from one point of view just to kind of stay in that headspace. But for the most part, I just write straight through the whole book.
How's it coming up with banter between the characters and like the different personalities? I feel like that would always be so hard.
It is hard. It is hard. And I really do love writing banter between characters. And sometimes it cracks me up because I will sit there for hours to write like 10 lines of dialogue. And then, later it just feels like quick and snappy. And I'm like, that was not quick and snappy in my head. It took me forever. But I have a house full of teenage boys and they are hilarious. They're also a pain, but they are hilarious and I love them dearly. And I really do love like writing like soldiery banter and, like that whole kind of like family banter. There's always romantic banter too, but that kind of stuff is fun for me to write.
I've always thought of fantasy as more of a very visual medium. So I was wondering if you use like mood boards or any specific type of playlists or anything like that to build your world where you're expanding them and creating the detail of them.
So I don't. I really don't. People always ask me like, do I have a fan cast? And I'm like, no, I don't. For me, it's all in my head. And it feels very visual. Like I can see it as I'm writing, see it almost like a movie, but I don't use any of like I wish I could, because some people have such beautiful, beautiful vision boards for their books. I do make playlists, like as songs kind of attach themselves to characters in my head. I guess that's more of a listening.
We have one down over here.
I'm curious if there are any characters that you put any traits from yourself into, any quirks, any personality or anything physical. Is there anything that you put in?
I would say, there's a little bit of me in everybody, in all of the different characters. I find that kind of happens. I feel like that happens for every writer. So there's going to be a little bit of me in all of them. In the Cursebreaker trilogy, I have a character named Leah Mara who is, very bookish and has, always kind of been overlooked by her mother, who really kind of finds a new strength within herself. She probably has the most of me that I've poured into a character.
We have like 4 minutes left, so we have time for maybe 1 or 2 final questions. If anyone has something down over here.
Raleigh Passett, are you a Swiftie or no?
Yeah. I didn't like cry when she got engaged, but I absolutely like her music. When I was in high school, I had a picture of, this is so stupid, I can't believe I'm admitting this in front of people. I had a picture of Nick from the Backstreet, and I don't even know what, like looking back, I'm like, Nick, Brigid, come on. Like on my dashboard in my car. I was 17, okay? Honestly, it's interacting with the readers. It is, usually when I come home from a convention, I am so supercharged to keep writing. Like seeing and hearing the passion that readers have for these stories, like knowing that writers are, sitting in their basement or sitting at their kitchen table, like it's such a solitary endeavor to write a story, and then to like physically go out in the world and see people having like an emotional reaction to your story or wanting to talk to you about characters that have just lived in your head. That's really magical. It's really, really magical. I love it.
Nice to hear.
All right, we have 2 minutes, so any final questions?
I am curious what your editing process looks like.
Oh, wow. So I will write a little bit and then I will go back over it and I'll revise it. And then so I'm very much an editor as I go. So by the time I get to the end of my first draft, it's not really a first draft and I'm ready to just send it off to my editor or to my agent. When the book is done, I will usually get a letter from my editor which will say, here are all the things that aren't working or are working, or this needs to be stronger, or this moment wasn't earned, whatever. And I'll usually go through the book just front to back, trying to fix things as I go. With writing, it tends to be like if you pull one thread, it starts to pull the whole thing apart. And, from there, I love the editorial stage. Like, for me, drafting is hard. There's an expression, it's like, I don't like writing. I love having written. And that's very much me. Yeah. Sure.
Any takers for our final question? Go for it.
What is the strangest research you've had to do for a book?
The strangest research. Oh my goodness. Wow. So when I was, I don't know if this is necessarily strange. My very first series was about these 4 brothers who controlled the elements of like earth, air, fire, and water. And they were these 4 teenage boys. And I just kept thinking about like all of the different shenanigans they could get up to, like with these elemental powers. And I remember trying to research like what would happen if a bolt of lightning struck a bag of fertilizer. Yeah, so that was probably one of my...
That was excellent. What was the answer though?
I'm trying to remember. I think that it does like explode a little bit. Yeah.
That's wild.
I feel like if a bolt of lightning hits anything, it's going to explode.
Yeah. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us for our live interview and for my first convention event. So thank you all for your questions and for playing a little bit of pass the mic and running across rooms to pass the mic. So thank you so much for all of that and for all of your support. If you want to stop by the Must Love Books podcast vendor table, I am giving out free stickers to anyone who subscribes to the podcast on whatever app you listen to, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. And you can listen to this live recording. Should be available if you want to check it out again. And thank you all. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you all. This was really awesome.
Thank you everyone for listening. This has been Must Love Books. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon under @MustLoveBooksPodcast. Thank you and happy reading.